Hey all, welcome to Filmsuck, a Patreon podcast in which we ponder the work of art in the age of crap cinema. I'm Eileen Jones. I'm the film critic for Jacobin Magazine, and I'm on my own here today, doing this little experiment in an audio-visual essay instead of my usual text essay. And I found a Halloween-themed topic. Hoping to skin in just before Halloween. Should open probably should be available Halloween Day. I just want to pay a fervent tribute to two films, Coraline and ParaNorman. They're the first two films made by Laika Entertainment, and it's two masterpieces that came out, 1, 2 in 2009 and 2012. And they're these rare gifts in stop motion animation. That's a really, really notoriously difficult, labor intensive form. I'll talk more about that later. But it's so rare to have masterpieces to talk about, especially in the 2000s. It's been getting steadily bleaker in the world of American cinema, as most of you know who follow movies at all. And especially if you live in a place like I do, where you don't get access to a lot of the world's films. They just hardly ever come. Sometimes they don't come at all, or it takes weeks and weeks extra to get to you. So if you're in New York City or LA, you're going to have much better access to a wider expanse of films than I am. I'm being confined a lot of the time to whatever America can churn out, and it's been pretty bleak and increasingly bleaker over the couple of weeks. So it's nice to just have two thrilling, great, fantastically high achieving films as these films are. You know, Coraline, I'm actually wearing, if you notice, I'm wearing a yellow raincoat, which I'm going to take off in a minute. It's too hot. This is in tribute to Coraline. She has very distinctive clothes. She's a very individualistic preteen. And in one scene, she's wearing her yellow raincoat, her yellow boots. She's got a star sweater, a blue star sweater. And blue boots. She's got orange pajamas. She's got these gloves that she desperately wants. Her mother won't buy her because of their economic circumstances, which are tough. But you can get merch like this for Coraline. Readily online. Here's her little dragonfly pin. There's an assortment of Coraline merch. It's the more popular film it was when it came out. It wasn't even a huge hit, but it was a notable hit, especially for a first film out of a little company that's located in Portland, and wasn't at all well known. Obviously, it was just starting, but it's gone on to be an ever more popular favorite. So the 15th anniversary of Coraline was this year. I think it's still in theaters. It was released this fall. Again for Halloween, I'm presuming, and just to honor the 15th year of this great film. So yeah, you can get this stuff a lot easier than you can ParaNorman stuff. ParaNorman also made money, but less money. It was kind of a very, very modest success. It's every bit as good. It's just a phenomenally great film, but it's not nearly as well known or appreciated. So here's all you can see. You can see back here, I have a little ParaNorman poster, but when you go to try to buy ParaNorman merch, there's much less to choose from. But it deserves every bit as much of a heartfelt appreciation as Coraline does. So I'm going to do that first. We'll start with ParaNorman for once, the second film. If you haven't seen ParaNorman, I can't urge you enough to go see it. Especially if you have kids, they will love it. It's a delightful film for, they say all ages, and usually they don't really mean that. It's a horror themed comedy, and again, it's stop motion animation. It's a Laika film. It's about a lonely 11-year-old boy named Norman who can see and interact with, talk to the dead. And obviously, this doesn't do him. This isn't great for him socially. He lives in what seems to be a fairly small town called Blythe Hollow, Massachusetts. It was designed to be a composite town by the filmmakers. They wanted it to be like a number of Massachusetts towns, including Salem. So it's a place where there's a tourist industry, and it's all based on the rather dark history of the town, the dark 17th century history of Puritan witch hunts, which went on in the town. So the slogan, the sort of motto of the town is Blythe Hollow, a great place to hang around. And it's on billboards and things with an image of a witch grinning but dangling from the end of a noose. So it's got this macabre quality, and just very cheesy, tacky stores that are all very witch themed and paranormal themed. There's witches' wieners and a hot dog place and that kind of thing. So, and it seems to be a kind of down at heel town. In other words, a not super prosperous town. So the whole town is designed to look like it's sort of all the houses are sagging and listing to one side, and there's a lot of rusty chain link and litter and cracked sidewalks, and it just has that sort of seedy lower middle class, people can't quite keep it up air, and that's definitely true of Norman's family. They're very, very working class people. You can tell, just you don't know exactly what they do for a living, the parents, but you can just see by the way they dress, the way they live. At one point, the mother says, she wants to go out to dinner. She wants to have a dinner that somebody else microwaved. The father wears, very, sturdy flannel shirts. You can just tell money is an issue in this family. But also in the community in general. So there he lives, and he's by no means a popular citizen. He's regarded as freak. He's called that when he first gets to school the first morning. He sees it written on his locker, and it's such a familiar thing to see that he takes Windex out of his locker essentially, and a cloth, and just cleans it off, and you can tell he's used to doing that every day. But before he ever gets there, we see him walk his usual route to school. And he's just running a gamut he's greeting. You can't see who he's talking to people all the way down as he's walking down this lonely street. And at one point he leans over to talk to a raccoon that's roadkill on the road. And then he's spotted by another townsperson who looks at him very, very suspiciously, which they all do all the time, because he's clearly regarded as there's something wrong with this kid. And there's a really nice shot where they, you can't see what he's talking to, and then the color warms up as the camera, pans around behind him, and when you come out the other side, you can see what he sees, which is just all, people from all different eras on the sidewalk, and they've got a kind of vaporous green look, and they know him, they see him every day. So there's a 50s leather jacketed Fonzie rocker, kind of guy. There's a 1930s gangster figure. There's an 1860s Union soldier with, and I couldn't love this more, the voice of Johnny Cash saying, "As you were, soldier." Somebody's doing a Johnny Cash imitation. Again, this kind of detail is just thrilling for me. This is when I absolutely knew, boy, this is my company. I love this. Because somehow Johnny Cash and the Union that's just right. I don't care if he's a Southerner. So he goes along politely greeting everybody as he goes. So he has this whole other life that is, he can't hide from the community. And so when he arrives at school, he has to run a gamut. Everyone just stop. Every other student stops and sort of looks at him again in that hostile way, and they all move apart so he can come through. So we get to see this glimpse of his, rather bleak, ordinary life as a very isolated kid in this town. But when he's cleaning off his locker, a friendship starts with another isolated kid. It's a kid named Neil, and as he's wiping off his locker, he turns around and sees Neil's got Fatty. Somebody's put on his locker, and he's wiping it off too. So Neil is going to make a huge effort to be friends with Norman, and Norman will say, "I keep telling you, Neil, I just like to be alone." And Neil will say, "Great, let's do that together." He's just a hugely cheerful and phlegmatic kid that you can't rattle. I mean, he talks about how he is as bullied as Norman is. And he'll just laugh and say, and list all the reasons. He'll be like, "Well, I'm fat. My eyes leak because I got allergies." He'll just go down and he says, I have a kitten lunchbox. There's a whole bunch of stuff, but he's super cheerful and seems to have arrived at a kind of whatever philosophy about this. And he calls it, this is just human nature, as he explains to Norman, or what you might call survival of the thickest. And so they begin this nice friendship, but very early on in stages, as they're leaving school that day, Norman has a weird great uncle that's also a recluse and notorious in the town. Neil calls him that stinky old bum who lives up on the hill. And he's accosted by, his name is Mr. Prendergast. And he he has an urgent message he has to give to Norman about the curse, that's a witch's curse that's supposedly on the town that he's been holding back all these years. But he needs to pass this on to someone else who can also interact with the dead, and Norman is it. So there's this, first he's hiding, Mr. Prendergast is hiding behind this giant witch statue that's in the middle of town. And he's hiding behind it, and he goes, psst. And Neil turns to Norman and says, that statue just pissed at us. It's very nice. So it's a kind of witty script throughout. It's very funny, but it also has kind of dark themes about bullying of kids, what it's like to be alone and isolated, what's it like to have the whole town, to be a kind of town pariah. They're going to wind up linking what's going on with Norman to what's going on with Abigail, who's going to turn out to be an actual ghost child of someone, a child who was executed by the Puritans for being a witch. I'm going to get rid of the Coraline coat because I'm dying. And not only are they're going to look somewhat alike, clearly, she's some sort of ancestor of his. And they're going to she's going to have encountered the same, ring of hostile glances that he does, but of course with far more terrible repercussions. She actually winds up being executed. She and her mother both. So that's ultimately going to be what's going on behind the witch. This is spoilery, sorry, but we always spoil everything on Filmsuck, so in the tradition. So ultimately the whole rest of the plot is going to be engaged with Norman having this land on him. His great uncle, Mr. Prendergast, is going to wind up dying, but then haunting him, coming back from the dead to insist that he has to take up this task. Norman can't even understand the task. It's you have to go to the witch's grave before midnight that night, and read to her from a book. He somehow, it doesn't work. He's reading at the graves where all the judges were, and it's not working, and he can't understand it, and then it's too late. A giant witch face, a terrifying witch face, appears in the sky, and pretty soon the zombie Puritan dead, the judges, are all rising from their graves, looking quite terrifying, as you can imagine, after moldering in their graves for 200 years. And that's going to be the start of all the mayhem as they, the Norman and flees to town, and the people who wind up being his reluctant cohorts, and that's his sister Courtney, who's a very kind of snarky, self-involved, popular cheerleader teen. The guy she becomes interested in, that's Neil's older brother Mitch. Neil and Alvin, the local, Norman's particularly relentless local bully. They're all going to wind up somehow involved in trying to grapple with this huge emergency. They wind up fleeing to town, and they're followed, by these shambling zombies who also shamble into town, and everything that's going to happen after that. So that's the basic plot. Sorry, but plot, of course, as always, can't really convey, even in our plot addicted era, it can't really convey what the delights of Paranorman are. I think it can help to talk about the opening imagery a little bit, just so you can get a sense of how detailed and how witty and how confident. Like Coraline, it's like a boldly assured film, and there's just detail everywhere. Kind of indicating that bring layers of complexity to this tale. So, before we ever get to, okay, now it's time for Norman to walk to school, the kind of what's his normal day like situation. You start the film, first you get a kind of 1970s lava lamp swirling image with like feature presentation, which was a very 70s drive-in image. So that's on the screen, and it's, Academy ratio, so old, to announce its age and its era. And then it segues into this very clever parody of low-budget zombie films of the 70s, with a, not talented at all, but very, very stroppy and impatient teenage girl whose job is to scream horribly and be attacked by zombies. There's this thing where she has to bend over to pick something up off the floor, and it's clearly just to get a shot of her butt, a lingering shot of her ass, which it shows you. And there's a teenage boy playing a zombie who's also, not particularly gifted. And he's shambling toward her, but it's so slowly. Remember, it was the era of slow zombies. She has to keep screaming and screaming and screaming until she finally just looks impatiently into the camera, like, how long do I have to scream before this zombie gets to me so he can eat my brain? So that's what's happening on TV. And then you pull back a little, you see Norman watching. He's sitting very close to the TV, watching clearly a favorite genre film for him. And then you hear what's happening now. It's his grandmother who's sitting on the sofa watching with him. And he explains to her, well, she's getting her brain eaten by a zombie. And she says, well, that's not very nice. If they just talk it out, they could, oh no, there goes ParaNorman. Oh, oh no. We've got a little haunting going on here, perhaps. But anyway, yeah, so he's explaining this to his grandmother, with great affection. They're clearly close. And, when he goes out into the kitchen after he's been watching the movie, he winds up, his grandmother has said, tell your father to turn up the heat. My feet are cold. He tells his father this, and it causes this huge flap because Norman keeps talking about what his grandmother says. And this flips out his family because, of course, they don't know what he's talking about. And they think he just can't deal with her death. So his father says, holding on to his patience barely. His father's like, your grandmother's dead, but she's in a better place now. And Norman's like, no, she's not. She's in the living room. And that's kind of both a truthful statement and a funny statement because, again, the living room isn't such a hot place to be. It's a kind of, it's a lower middle class house. It's a little bit saggy and worn and a million details to kind of show you that. When we do get a glimpse of, and there's a hilarious point too, when the mother is always being ultra sympathetic to Norman and trying to get his father to be more patient. The father's always arguing, we can't have this kid going on like this. And Norman is trapped between them, and we see their two stomachs. And there's the father's kind of beer gut, his big flannel plaid beer gut. And then we see his mother's kind of little, lower in the stomach pouch, under her jeans. And he's like, his head is right between the two of them as they argue over his head about him. So there's all this strife about this, Norman. And concern that from the father that he's going to wind up turning out like that crazy uncle of yours, he says to his wife. So that's Mr. Prendergast, who winds up a town, recluse, not homeless, but doing very badly, as we can see from he's wearing an ancient like parka, and it's all worn so believably and well. It's also done so well to show how old these things are, how, not new, not shiny, not glamorous, any aspect of the family's life. Any of them are. When we get a look at Norman's bedroom, we see he's got a complete preoccupation of his own that's separate from the town, but clearly also intertwined with it. For his favorite films, which are zombie films. So it's just zombie films everywhere, themed everywhere. His morning alarm clock makes it groan, is a series of groans from zombie sounds. His toothbrush, his slippers, everything you look at is got this kind of obsession. So you can see where his father would get this idea that what's wrong with Norman is this weird death obsession that it must stem from the grandmother. So right away from the beginning, and I can't even describe, even now I've watched it like 10 times, I will always see something different in all the different belongings Norman has, all of his different posters. It's like this when you get a glimpse of Mr. Prendergast's very lonely, very hoarder-like house, and his study in particular. You'll see book titles, new book titles he didn't see the time before, that are all stacked up all over the place. One the title is "You're Not Creepy," because he's constantly working with the fact that the whole town thinks of him as a creep and someone to avoid, and he's trying to learn to live with this. So that is, he's foretelling the fate that could come to poor Norman if he continues down the path he's on in this town. I should note that the voice performances are just phenomenal throughout, and really inventive. It's not the typical kind of Disney thing, especially where just big mainstream animation thing now, where they just a bunch of famous people are hired to get name value. there's names here, but they're not, it's not like they're going to send you racing to the theaters. It's not, top people, but it's interesting people. Doing Norman is Cody Smith McPhee. If you might remember him for what is it, Year of the Dog. He plays the young man who goes up against the Benedict Cumberbatch, disturbed macho character. He's playing Norman. He does a wonderful job as a voice actor. Casey Affleck is playing the teenage boy Mitch, the muscle bound brother of Neil. Elaine Stritch is the grandmother. Yeah, phenomenal performance. She's a showbiz old timer who's really brilliant. Anna Kendrick is very funny as the annoying teenage girl Courtney, who's so impatient with her brother but gets sucked into his whole witch zombie ghost problem. A very, very appalled to be there, but has to be there. Christopher Mintz-Plasse is Alvin the bully. So he's not playing, if you've seen Christopher Mintz-Plasse performances, he always plays bullied nerds himself. So it's funny to see him get to play a bully finally. He gets to play Alvin. Leslie Mann is Norman's mother. So just throughout, just great, great performances. But John Goodman is maybe the greatest as Mr. Prendergast. There is literally a coughing fit that Mr. Prendergast is in his last days. His health is terrible, and he's trying to tell when the statue pissed at us when he first confronts Norman with this whole witch's curse thing that Norman's going to have to deal with. He's trying to urgently tell him, like, knowing his time is short, he's trying to tell him, what have you got to do? This convoluted thing he has to do. And he keeps breaking down into these fits of coughing that stop him from telling Norman what he has to do. So it's the most inventive coughing fit you will ever see. Brilliant in its variety as it keeps going and keeps getting funnier as he can't get it out. And of course he's chased off by Neil, or that scary fat kid, as Mr. Prendergast called him, who throws his lunch at him, throws an apple first, and then a little container of hummus, and he says, "Don't make me throw this hummus. It's the spicy kind." And that scares off Mr. Prendergast. But one of the important things to note about the process at Laika for voice acting, at least then, they actually brought all the actors in to interact. So it isn't the typical thing that they do now, where it's any actor who does a behind the scenes thing will tell you, someone will say, "How was it working with so and so?" And they'll be like, "I never met him." You go into a glass booth. One of the reasons celebrities love to do these parts. It's such easy money. It takes no time at all. It's no fuss. You walk in, you're given your lines. There's a director, presumably somebody is saying, do it, a little more like this, a little more like that, and you're alone in a booth just delivering a series of lines. That does not aid in performances. That's not a good way to do performances. And when they interview all of these actors for the extras on ParaNorman, they go into that. What a huge difference it makes for all of it, for the people who are interacting to actually be interacting, because then somebody will do something inventive, you will then modify what you would have done. It's all of that interplay, which is key to acting, that makes a huge difference. I remember watching Rango. It's another masterpiece of the 2000s that's not nearly appreciated enough. One of the great animated films, and they literally did it as a play. The whole cast got together and did the whole thing, and then broke it out and did the lines. But again, the person you were interacting with was there. So it's a much better way. So you just really get quite inspired performances in ParaNorman and Coraline, both cases. But casting is also it's very inventive and smart and targeted. You can tell they're going after qualities more than anything. That makes a huge difference. If you do watch the extras for either ParaNorman or Coraline, and I highly recommend it, normally that's not always that interesting. In the case of it's fascinating because this is such a work-intensive form. It's really insane for anyone to have taken this on. If you don't know, the CEO of Laika is Travis Knight. His father is Phil Knight of Nike. So his father basically bought his son in this company. And so at least you got a guaranteed, revenue stream, which you're going to need because it's always a couple of years between Laika films. And they also have an animated advertising house. They make commercials and things. And they sometimes farm out their labor. For example, Corpse Bride has Laika Entertainment work done on it. So but it's a couple of years to do these films. So yeah, Leica House does ads and Leica Entertainment does their feature films, but it's always a reliable 2 to 3 years, and the process is so insane that it's jaw dropping to watch. I mean, most people have a sense of what the filming process is like for stop motion animation. So just the obvious, like here's your figure, and you've got to move it 1 millimeter. If it's going to walk, across something, you got to have it go doot, and then you stop, and you get that shot. Then you go doot, and you stop, and you doot, and each one is a separate shot. So pretty soon you get the 24 frames a second illusion of movement. But it's somebody having to take the little model and go cheek. And then anything else that has to move, if it's a fall scene and there are leaves coming down, well, each leaf has to come down a tiny bit, a millimeter, whatever it is. And so that process alone is it's mind-boggling how time-consuming that's going to be. And to see people working on the sets, the kind of miniaturized sets with the miniature figures, all these people looming over them to try to move all the little figures to get another shot. That's just glacial pace, but obviously. But so that's awesome already. There's that amount of dedication to get these effects. But it's even before they get there. It's years of work. It's years of work. It's in a level of detail, at least the way Leica is doing it, you cannot believe. They're so into the when they started, they had a complete dedication to handcrafted. They were clearly trying to encounter the super slick look of especially Pixar, but all animation, all mainstream animation now. Way too slick looking because it's all computer shit. It's all computer generated shit. So, but even just the nature of these computer graphics from the earliest experimental days had that geometric, smooth quality. If you look at, when Pixar was first on the rise and they're first experimenting with this, it was, what you could first do was geometric shapes, and the easiest surfaces you could do were these smooth, shiny, kind of plasticky looking surfaces. Anything like skin and hair and that kind of textures were much harder. So I think that really led to, a kind of bias in favor of the smooth and the round. It's also, Pixar people like John Lasseter, always obsessed with the Disney legacy, always wanting to be part of it. And of course, the look of the Disney legacy, even when it was hand drawn, was all rounded and cute and very clean and smooth looking. So that's the direction everything. And of course, since that's Pixar is the Pixar Disney are the huge, successes. They pretty much own a kind of, children's entertainment brand at least. So they're just considered the greatest of the animated film companies that have been for generations. Everyone tends to imitate them. So this was a deliberate, my favorite thing is always anyone who's rebelling against this to give us anything else, because otherwise it all looks the same. So Rango was clearly totally defiant, totally like in the spirit of Warner Brothers, which was the first defying setup. Warner Animation was all like, let's go the other way. When they're cute and adorable and sweet, we'll make ours loud and rangy and big and awkward and not so beautiful. And, morally, they're going to be very elastic and much more raucous and all of that stuff. So that kind of refusal has always drawn me very strongly. So, you go for more Rango, there's just not a lot of rebellion, but early Leica is clearly going that way. So a refusal of symmetry, for example, and clean lines. So when you look at the way, ParaNorman looks, I'll just hold up his you can see the image. You can see kind of how the spikier look. Norman literally has hair that stands straight on end. He tries to comb it down. It won't comb down. It'll just spring back up like brush. Neil has tight, ginger curls. He's a redhead. You've got a lot of intensifying of like movement and more exaggerated, spikier, and more angular qualities to almost everything. Norman's head is very, very big, and his body is very, very skinny. So the exaggerated sizes of people. There are very hefty people, for example, which made balancing the figures quite hard. So there's like the drama teacher who has this theatrical, oratorical delivery that's very funny. She's just enormous with gigantic armed figure on tiny tottering little legs. So is Mr. Prendergast. He's quite a big bulky guy on smaller feet. But the big head look is true for both Coraline and ParaNorman. They both have very big headed figures on, especially the kids are very thin bodied. But there's just an endless amount of work that goes into the pre-production, what you I guess you could call um, uh, phase. It goes on for months and months, and it's an army of craftspeople and they show you just the intricate details of the hair. Since I talked about that, Norman's hair is literally made out of a certain kind of brush. I think it's two kinds of brushes together, the more bristly and the less bristly, and they're dyed a couple of different colors of brown and darker brown and black. So there's all this careful selection of materials, dyeing of materials, and having to affix it. They start with a skeleton, so there's a metal skeleton to each figure with obviously joints that all move, so that you can see how they're going to be able to use that to position and move figures with knees that seem to work right, and ankles. And then of course they 3D printed. There's pioneering work done in both Coraline and ParaNorman when it comes to 3D printing kind of puppet parts, puppet faces, for example, and they're all split face animation, meaning it's part of half of the face. Often, sometimes even they can even do quarters. That way, by swapping out these 3D printed, a little smile, a bigger grin, a look of horror, all the different expressions. Because you've got split faces, you can combine and recombine them. One statistic they give out in the Coraline extras is that there were 250,000 possible expressions for Coraline alone. So that's how much swapping out to get these amazingly engrossing performances out of puppets. Every bit of clothing is handmade, hand stitched, hand dyed, hand cut, hand sewed, the whole thing. Coraline's little star sweater we'll get into it. Her other mother makes her this wonderful sweater that again you can buy. You can buy an adult size online. That's crazy. You can buy her pajamas. It's crazy. Was literally there's a woman with the tiniest possible, like thinnest, I should say, knitting needles, making the sweater. And if they needed extra sweaters, they had to make. It took her months just to do the design and knit the little sweaters. The hair, again, going back to Neil, each of his red hair, and again, they make sure there's several tones of red. So it's like real hair. You have multiple colors in your hair. So not only do they make them, dye them separately. I forget what material they are, some kind of, twiny string, I'm not sure. And they make little rosettes out of them, these little round curls out of them, and then dry them in that position. But dozens of them, dozens. That's just to make Neil's hair. But you look at all these little cubby holes, there's all these little craftspeople working away assiduously at their little I'm in charge of Neil's hair job. Most people would probably say I go stir crazy. I couldn't. For me, it's just like I look at that and I'm like, boy, am I in the wrong line of work. God, I would love that. I would have totally adored that. To be able to just sit there quietly working on your little craftsperson thing at such a high level, because it all once you know this, you can you watch it once just to watch it and enjoy it, and then once you know some of the stuff, you can just watch it again to be awed. Like, that is so intricate, that is so detailed, that is so thinking of every possible quality that's going to go with this kid that has to be nailed down. So that kind of, in Travis Knight, they interview him, and he's like, admittedly, we're just kind of nuts. That we're the kind of people who love to get into this sort of thing. So I highly recommend just getting into the extras if you have any interest in this form. The two, for the two DVDs, here they are, Coraline, ParaNorman. I love DVDs. All of you people who went to, online only, you're crazy, because, they already are. They're locking up their content. All these major companies, they lock up their content for as many years as they want to. You may never see the stuff you want again if you don't own it. So think of the capitalist hell that you live in, and secure the films that you really love and will want to watch again. Make sure you got them, because there's no guarantee they'll be available. Sorry, that was a commercial. That was my own little socialist commercial. One thing to note too, good ghost films are rare. Good horror films are rare, and for a delightful effervescent comedy, this has some really nice effects. The zombies are wonderful. There's when the head Puritan judge bursts out of his grave and does this big scream of kind of both horror and triumph that he's alive again, and he's got a long, incredibly elongated green face, and their jaws are all loose, and he's the scariest one of the group of zombies that rise. Um, it's effective. It's both. It has a little tinge of scary to go with the generally funny tone. So and it's just and there's just beautiful lighting effects going on. So when Norman is first watching the zombie film, and there's all these lurid greens and pinks, and everything is green that's sort of pinkish red, and everything to try to amp up. Low budget. It's a room. It's a bare room, so they got to do something to make it look thrilling in some way. Well, that lighting goes away, of course, mostly in his regular life, and then comes back again when the witch rises, and it's just a giant face that's made of kind of cloudy, sheety qualities things that are giant in the air and move, and they create a kind of lurid green and purple face. And the judge rises out of the grave, and he's got a green face with kind of mauve shadows. So there's all this attention paid to everything, but the color scheme as well. So throughout there's just all of these formal pleasures where you're like, wow, they have neglected nothing here. I mean, every aspect of every frame is just wonderful. I mean, and there are details like when the sun goes behind Norman's head, he has stick out ears, so you can see the sun shining through his ears. You can virtually see the veins in his ears. The way they want to be off center and offbeat in every way. So again, they're rejecting symmetry in the design of the film with all this listing, sagging houses. They literally decided to have not a straight line. And they're working with engineers who are going to build things, carpenters and engineers, and they're horrified because it's like their straight lines are their thing, and they have to adjust every line in the thing so there won't be any straight lines. God, that's work. Norman's nostrils are uneven, and one is slightly larger than the other. It's just like the details are unbelievable, but all dedicated to this. We want a unique look that's suitable to the material. And that's certainly in no imitation, nothing like what you would see in Disney Pixar films. It's completely its own thing. And that costs Laika. It means it's not gonna reel in the money in the same way. Then that's the danger of this kind of work. And if you look at the rest of the Laika films, they get less and less like this. As you move from Box Trolls to Kubo and the Two Strings, to what was their last one? Missing Link. It's getting more and more smooth. So by the time you get to Missing Link, it's still an oddball story about oddball characters, but the look of it has gotten much more shiny and generic than it was to begin with. And one can only, and it's mournful to say, but each film since Coraline has done less well. Each one it's been like a toboggan ride downhill. Each film until the last three films that Leica have not been profitable. So that's not a very healthy situation. Again, lucky thing you've got this billionaire, Phil Knight, who wants his son, presumably, to keep his company, because it has not been a pretty picture as far as their ability to make money. And I have to agree. I hate to say it. I'm a big follower. I always watch their films, but each one has gotten steadily less impressive, less enjoyable since the first two triumphs. And this is a horrible shame. So anyway, we'll get back to that. Let me just quickly do some comparisons. I won't talk as long about Coraline, probably just because most of you, if you know any of the Laika films, you know Coraline. Much more famous film. But it really was what seemed to be an exciting, when you saw the two films together, wow, they've really got a niche here. They've really staked out themes and an approach to audience, and a look that is very individual, that's going to make this company stand out and do its own thing. as opposed to all the other animation companies, especially Disney Pixar. So kind of gothic and horror themes in both a very individualistic child at the center, a preteen, an older child, 11ish for both, 11ish, 12ish. So both kind of isolated in Coraline's case for different reasons, but both kind of, Coraline's very spiky, very assertive. Whereas Norman is kind of shy, and he's been bullied and people don't listen to him. But he's still got a highly individual outlook and way of life that he's devised on his own in isolation. So that, kind of similar figures, and again, roughly similar silhouettes, very large heads, very skinny bodies, and in Coraline, there's a kind of funny joke about them there's a cat character I'll get to, and a friend character, Wybie, and they all have these big heads, and at a certain point, they all tilt their heads to look at each other, and it's just this utterly charming moment that seems to be an almost exchange of awarenesses of we are these offbeat creatures, but we're all offbeat together, and it's a kind of community moment that's a gorgeous thing at the end of Coraline. So that kind of theme, that kind of lead character, and aiming at an audience, and this was pretty clearly announced by them. We're after older children, so we can deal with themes that are older. We can deal with just content that, for want of a better word, I wish there was a better word than that just skews a little older. So older children up through adult was going to be what they were after. Whereas, Disney Pixar has to really take into account it's going to be very young children who want to go to these things in huge numbers. So you have to keep that in mind. So, an example, when Mr. Prendergast in ParaNorman confronts Norman and finally it's the ghost now, finally gets across what he has to do. And he's trying to get Norman to promise to do it, because it means he saves the whole town, in other words, by reading to this witch and keeping her in her grave. And he's saying to Norman, you've got to do this, swear. And he keeps saying swear over and over, and Norman, not understanding, says, you mean the F word? And so again, that's a reference to a word that you can't say, but it's still a reference that's clear. So again, it's a small way of delineating who your audience is, what your age group is. So Coraline, let's get it for so just and one last biggie. Class for both was huge, which was very exciting for me, because I wrote a long piece for Jacobin about this a number of years back, about how Laika Films seemed, at least in the earliest films, to be very highly aware of class in a way that is just not done. And I did a whole research study of the way Disney and Pixar are notorious for ignoring anyone who's less than middle class to way affluent. It just is as if people who are any poorer than that don't exist. They're not represented. But if they do get represented, there's often a series of, in a very biased way. You must be, a kind of representation that's indicating values that aren't the best. Like, well, you'll characterize someone as lazy at the same time if they're not prosperous, that sort of thing. And there are big studies, which I quote, about what percentage of films has any positive representation of people who are lower class, who are even impoverished at all, and it's tiny. There's almost none. So everything got moved up into the far more affluent classes. Okay. And, there are studies that have been done of what are very young children's attitudes class-wise. And, the argument is it's reflected in the kind of movies and TV shows they watch. And because this is such a common prejudice across the boards in all our media, you have children who are saying, yeah, well, poor people are lazy, not very clean. They'll go down a whole list of, somehow, they just haven't worked hard. They haven't tried. They're kind of low life types. So they've done interviews, and so there's all these studies that have been done. They used to be taken a lot more seriously. There used to be a very strong anti-Disney movement among a lot of people who were especially politically left, who would argue the way they represent nature, the way they represent class, the way they just, you go across the board, how ideologically Disney was, poison for kids. You didn't want them to, you didn't want their values being influenced by Disney. That has just died. Disney, Pixar, as far as I can tell, are pretty much everybody's recourse. But Coraline and ParaNorman both are just very, very class conscious. They're very money conscious in a way that connotes class. You're only worried about money when you are pinched, when you don't have it. So I've already described, Norman's case, they're very working class in a way where it doesn't get thematized so much as you can just read it in the homes, the way the buildings look, the whole town has a kind of rundown quality to it. It's much more specific in Coraline. In Coraline, she and her parents have just moved to a place that's clearly in the Pacific Northwest, but in a kind of more rural area, so it's a bit isolated. They've moved into a place called the Pink Palace Apartments, and it was clearly once was a grand house, a grand estate house, but it's been cut up into apartments. But again, it's very spare looking. It's very, and the other people who live in the apartments, also have these qualities of people who don't have money. And Coraline's parents are explicitly like, look, until their jobs are, they write these gardening catalogs, and they're up against a huge deadline. They've just moved. And they're like, Coraline, we just have no time and we have no money until we meet this deadline, and then we get paid for our latest gardening catalog. You're kind of on your own because we're going to be working like crazy every day to meet this deadline, and there's just no money. So the dad cooks, and he makes these horrible concoctions of what odds and ends are still in the fridge. So these just, I can't even remember what they are, but they're just like nasty. And Coraline won't eat hers. We see in an early, because it's so awful, so she has to go to bed without eating. There's a scene, of course, as I already said, the issue of the gloves. Coraline's her new school, she isn't going yet, is going to be, it has school uniforms. And so she's like, oh, but this will be great because, everyone will be wearing gray. The uniforms are gray, and I'll have these. I'll have this, so I'll have something that helps me stand out. She's very conscious of how she looks, what she wears, what she likes, what she doesn't. A very strong personality. And they're $24 or something, or $25. And her mother's just like, no, you can't have them. So this is another sore point. The basic plot of Coraline is, partly given that she's just had to move and her parents are so busy and there's no money, all of those things are adding up to she's just having a very unsatisfying experience in general. And this makes her easy prey for what's about to happen. There's a Gothic, classic Gothic thing about the building she lives in. Her apartment has a secret passageway. It's a tiny door in the wall that can be opened by a key. It's one of the million keys that they have in their drawer. She opens it, and it just looks like a dirty, dusty passageway. But at night, it comes alive. And there are these mice that live in the house that are Mr. Bobinski is one of the tenants. And he's an ex-circus performer. He's an acrobat, and he's always claiming he's training these mice to do wonderful things. So anyway, they will lead Coraline at night to the passage, and she'll go in, and the passage is transformed into this kind of magical glowing passageway. And she'll follow up into another house that looks like hers, only far more affluent and grand and very opulent in every way. And there's her other mother and her other father who look like her actual parents, but they're different in all the ways that will appeal most to Coraline in her present state of mind. They are completely focused on her and making her happy all the time. The mother's in the kitchen, cooking. When she sits down to dinner, it's a banquet. She has the choice of anything practically you could think of to eat. It's constant presence. The garden that is in her real house that's dying out there that they never go out and work in. It's always raining there anyway. Here has been transformed into just this paradise, and all the flowers, if you look at them from overhead, make up a portrait of Coraline's face, that's what the father has done for her. She gets presents constantly of new clothes, so the beautiful star sweater, the blue pants, the blue boots. So she's got this spectacular, life that is her ideal, and again, in this present frame of mind, discontented frame of mind. And at first it's like, well, she's just going back and forth. This couldn't be better. And pretty soon the offer is made, you could just stay here. And the only catch is, and she's presented in a nice little box, you have to have buttons sewn into your eyes, which is what they all have. They all have button eyes. And that's when she's finally alerted to the danger. She's had several warnings up to now. Mr. Bobinski has said to her, the mice say you shouldn't go through that. You shouldn't go through that passageway anymore. She's definitely getting warnings. But she's ignoring them because she's unhappy with the way her life is going in this new place. So it's all about, of course, very, very typical. Children get unhappy. There's going to be other children she'll encounter there, the ghost children, the lost ghost children, who are children who, same thing, but many, many generations earlier, decades, 100 years ago, whatever, lived in that house, got discontented, got drawn into the other world. They're preyed upon by the other mother, who's also the beldame. And each time Coraline goes back there are more and more disturbing insect-like changes to the other mother that are gradual at first. But once you know to be alert for them. Her clothes, the way her clothes are cut, are like the bottom of a wasp's body, and you start going, oh, I see it already. At first she looks just like the mother except for her button eyes, and then there's the shift, and by trip 4 or 5, she's this figure of utter terror. She elongates. She's got these terrifying these long, immensely long claw fingers. She's horrifyingly thin. But she's built essentially like a wasp creature. And she, of course, anything that you do that isn't totally, I love this, I love everything about this, and I love you, it isn't totally like pleased and dedicated and devoted all the time, it makes Coraline a bad daughter. And so the punishments are horrific. She gets thrown behind a mirror, and that's where the 3 ghost children are kept trapped forever. And she has to start really using her wits to get herself out of this trap. So that's going to be when the plot kicks in, so to speak, beyond what you've already seen. You've already seen her regular life that's, in this new place, but it's what her kind of daily life is. Mr. Bobinski's one neighbor upstairs in the basement apartment are Miss Spink and Miss Forcible, 2 ex-music hall entertainers who are British, and very dotty, eccentric old ladies. She'll visit these people because she's got absolutely nothing to do, and her parents just keep saying, go, go. And then there's a neighbor, we never see how far away he lives, Wyby. His name is short for Wyborn. And it's which is a very creepy name. And he's always being called by his grandmother, who we never see until the very end. And her grandmother sort of has, through him, we're getting grandmotherly warnings about the danger of living in the Pink Palace. It seems the grandmother once lived in that house. And her sister disappeared as a child and it was never seen again. So there's, again, all of these warnings that don't help because, there's poor Coraline meeting, Mr. Bobinski and Miss Forcible and Miss Spink, and with all their Scotty dogs, and they keep several who are alive, but all of their dead Scotty dogs have been taxidermied, put into angel wing outfits, and hung up on walls and are standing all around. And so it's very creepy and weird. And so Coraline is so much left to her own devices. It's just, that's part of the problem. So you've got this complete portrait. And that's true of ParaNorman too. There were critical complaints, I especially noticed about ParaNorman, that not enough plot happens. This is the plot sickness that you get in American films in general, and certainly in Pixar. Pixar is noted. They can't get enough story, and they swear by story is the only thing that matters. And we've just got in a kind of horrifying world that everyone accepts as ordinary, that everything has got to be just chock-a-block with plot events all the time. In both of these films, there's a lot of, let's just rest in the world. Let's look at the world that they're in. We want a lot of detail in the characters. This was very deliberate. If you look at the extras of ParaNorman, they talk about how, we wanted it to be. But now Norman, we've seen what his family life is. We've seen what his morning routine is. We're going to take him to school. We're going to see now his relationship to the paranormal, to the ghost figures. We're going to just slowly ease into, and then the plot will kick in. The bigger, more dramatic events will kick in. Same thing with Coraline. I should mention that there's a mysterious black cat that hangs around, doesn't belong to anyone in particular, seems to come along with Wybie, but then transfers over and starts hanging around a lot with Coraline. First, you don't know, is this another sign of the sinister? So he seems to be a very wise, sage cat. And he only speaks when they get into the other world. He follows her. He goes back and forth between the two worlds. And in the other world, he's wonderfully smooth and suave and wise and has all the best advice and is the best companion ever. He's a really enviable companion. So all of this characterization, again, is once you start the plot, you're going to see why you need all the characterization, all the detail. It's going to make it a much richer experience when Coraline's desperate need to get away from the beldam, who's now absolutely after her with needle hands. Giant, they're all made up now of needles by the end. And she's going to come clawing through the passage after Coraline. And she winds up taking her parents, and Coraline has to, said, I have to go back because I have to get my parents back. So it becomes very, very charged and very scary. And it's remarkably scary. I will say it's much scarier than Coraline because the other mother is such a terrifying figure. And what happens to other father is so awful. He's the nice affable one in real life. He's the mother is much more sharp-tongued, impatient. The father is much sweeter and more affable, and that hangs on in their other lives. But what happens to him when he starts trying to, it seems, do something for Warren Caroline, do something for Caroline? He's being like filleted from within. So his whole body is collapsing. His jaw starts collapsing down as she starts taking out her rage on him, on the other Wybie character whose mouth is sewn into a smile because as the father says, he pulled a long face and his whole face sags in this horrifying way. And mother didn't like that. And it's just like, it really is, quite eerie, quite scary. So you get these great effects, but they're built up over the course of a kind of slower plot development, slow and more character building, which is really welcome to me anyway. And again, same thing with this. If you watch the extra, it's mind-boggling. The amount of work that's going into pre-production and then production. Wow. Voice cast, again, brilliant. Dakota Fanning is Coraline Jones. Terry Hatcher is both the mother and the other mother and the beldam. So there's kind of multi-phase characters for all of these. Jennifer Saunders and Dawn French of French and Saunders fame, if you know your British comedy shows. Very hilarious. They're Miss Spink and Miss Forcible. Keith David is the cast. Keith David, if you remember him from, it's John Carpenter films. They Live, The Thing. He's just a tremendous actor. Should have had a much, much bigger career. It's a little embittering because he's so good. He's got even a tiny part in Jordan Peele's Nope, where he's the father of the main two characters who has the ranch. Even his tiny performance is brilliant. He didn't have the career he should have, but he's just great as the cat. John Hodgman is the father and other father. And I already said, Terry Hatcher is mother and other mother. Ian McShane is Mr. Babinski. So there's just, again, this very great, very eclectic, you can tell, very carefully selected cast. It isn't just who's hot now, who's a current star that we can get, who has name value. This is like, I wouldn't have thought that Ian McShane would have been, when you hear the voices, you're startled because Mr. Babinski has an elaborate, like, Eastern European accent. He's very eccentric, has very sprightly, crazy delivery. It's not the Ian McShane you tend to expect if you know him from John Wick and lots of other films. I think it's an opportunity for actors to be able to, like Terry Hatcher getting to do Other Mother and the beldam is just like, wow. How often does she get that chance? So it's that kind of, wow, we're not seeing the usual from these people, which is exciting also. So they're both, fabulous and gave us so much promise for what Laika Films was going to be that it's been disheartening to watch it sort of steadily the effect of the films. It's not like they aren't beautifully done. Kubo and the Two Strings, gorgeous, but it's just losing its highly idiosyncratic qualities. And again, moving away from, it's not, the whole gothic horror elements mixed with comedy. It dissipates. It just seems like that was almost like, did they give it up because they felt it wasn't drawing? I don't know. I haven't seen any interviews that say as much. Or did they always intend to branch out and have lots of different kind of films that don't keep those things going? I think it's a shame. I think they could have stuck with that and made it more of a thing and kept it going, and they didn't. But you can see it's got to be somewhat of a struggle. You've got to make some money, even if you're Phil Knight's son, I would think. But of course, what do I know? So that's been a little depressing. And Missing Link again was nice, and it had little inventive things, and it was very odd. You were just immediately going, who's this for? There's a lead character is a British explorer named Sir Lionel Frost, who's trying to become the greatest explorer ever by finding essentially, Bigfoot. And he finds this very gentle, erudite creature called, that they wind up calling Mr. Link. And he winds up, of course, wanting to protect Mr. Link, rather than exploit him for his own glory. But it's just odd. The whole thing seemed to miss. All the reviews say the same thing. It's just like, this is just such odd material to take on, especially given the audience that we first had talked about. You're aiming at kind of older children, preteen, teens, and then you can go on up into adult. So maybe adult, but even the adult is going to have to be a little odd. You're going to have to be more like me, and you actually know what the explorer figure in P.G. Wodehouse novels. How many people can talk about that? I could, but that's not a lot of people. And note that Missing Link came out in 2019. That's a long time ago. That's a way bigger gap than their usual 2-3 year gap. So by the time their next film, which is in production, it's called WILDWOOD, comes out, it's going to be what? Yeah, that's going to be 6 years. That's a 6-year gap between films. That is a little startling. One thing I will note, the directors, Travis Knight is he's going to be directing WILDWOOD, and he also did Kubo and the Two Strings. I hope he does better. I mean, it's just the greatest film, arguably, is Coraline. At least, it's arguably the greater. I would put ParaNorman right at the same level. Was Henry Selick's film. Henry Selick is a legend in stop motion animation. His Nightmare Before Night Before Christmas. No, what is it again? What is the hell is the name of it? The Nightmare Before Christmas, which is a perpetual holiday favorite, runs all the time. That's him. It's always billed as Tim Burton's. He directed, and that's not so. Or he produced rather, whereas Henry Selick directed it. But by calling it Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas, it's taken away from people's awareness that Henry Selick was the force behind this. So poor Henry Selick does Coraline. It's a masterpiece. He's given a totally, as with Nightmare Before Christmas, Tim Burton gave him a completely free hand. They had known each other all the way back at Cal Arts, before they each got their first jobs at Disney, and they both went to Disney and both found that, of course, they didn't fit into the Disney model at all. So Burton just said, go, I'll back you in whatever you want to do. So it was a triumph. And then same thing as Selick has said in interviews, same thing happened with Coraline. It tends to go better if I'm just given a free hand and nobody's interfering. He's encountered a ton of interference. Well, what happened? Why doesn't he just stay with Laika? It seems like that's a perfect match. He doesn't, because he gets a huge offer, like a can't turn it down kind of offer from Pixar. And if you're wondering why you can't remember a Henry Selick stop motion animation film ever coming out from Pixar, it's because he worked, years on a film and got halfway through the production and they pulled the plug. And he said it was just a nightmare because John Lasseter, it was, the chief creative officer and had his hand in everything there for a long time. He's been sidelined now because, he's been canceled. So at least officially, at least as far as we can tell on the surface, he's not nearly the upfront presence that he was at Pixar. He was just interfering constantly, according to Selick, and trying to Disneyfy, as he said, everything he was doing. So it was this constant creative battle between himself and Lasseter all the way through, and it was limping along. And finally, I think they were $50 million in. Some incredible amount of money had been spent, and they just pulled the plug. And there's poor Selleck, just high and dry, and he's walked away from Laika, and he's out there going, I mean, if he hadn't gotten a deal to do Wendell and Wild with Jordan Peele's company, when Jordan Peele is at his hottest and could help get him things made, and they made it for Netflix, but Netflix completely dumped it. And it, admittedly, there was interference again. People, the executives he was working with didn't seem to get what he was going for. They didn't like, say, the tough black girl who was at the center of it, who had tragically lost her parents. They wanted her to smile more, and he's like, she's not going to be going around smiling all the time. Her parents both died horribly. She's an orphan. She's being forced into Catholic school. Her whole situation is kind of grim, and she's supposed to be kind of tough. And so he had to fight battles all the time. And Wendell and Wild has wonderful things about it. And two characters are based on Key and Peele. The animation style is really great. There's wonderful things in it. It just doesn't come together all that well. And again, it was just dumped by Netflix. I think 2021, I think it was. And so, of course, I found it and watched it, but I felt like, and I reviewed it, but I felt like almost, it's just, you can mention Wendell and Wild anywhere, and almost very few people are going to know about it who aren't following stop motion animation or Henry Selick or something. So that's just heartbreaking to think that it seems as if he was going to go on with Laika, and then he got completely rerouted by Pixar, and it turned out to be this horrible dead end. And for some reason, who knows why, he's never gone back. And he was giving interviews with Wendell and Wild, and he said, well, maybe I have a chance to go back to Laika, but it kind of depends on how Wendell and Wild does. And that was a quote from him. And I was like, oh no, because Wendell and Wild did not do well. So why that? I don't know. I don't know what the behind the scenes story is, but all I can do is say, Laika, get Henry Selick back, because you've got talented people. The guys who did ParaNorman did a great job. Who are they again? They're Chris Butler and Sam Fell. It's a directing team, and they continue to be active at Laika, as far as I can tell, and that was very good. But I mean, Henry Selick, and he's 71 now. He's not going to live forever, but he's still, it seems, hardy enough that he can be a filmmaker, and you should really get him back. So that is my final plea and prayer in this episode, and I thank you all for paying attention to my infatuation with Coraline and ParaNorman, which is completely justified, by the way. If you don't know them, and again, I urge you, if you have kids, they will love them both. But even if you don't have kids, they're such great films. They're such great achievements that they both should get more attention, even though Coraline's pretty famous. But ParaNorman is that not nearly famous enough, needs to be far more appreciated film that I cannot recommend highly enough. So that is it for today. Thank you, as always, to our subscribers. Triple thanks to you for supporting, listening, watching. If you aren't a subscriber, but you like what you are seeing and hearing, please, follow us, sign up with Patreon for all of the content instead of just the half that you can always get. It's always publicly available. You can follow news of the podcast on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And in 2 weeks, Dolores and I will be back with another scintillating episode. We trust it will be scintillating anyway. And until then, we love you for listening. Bye now.